The quiet surrender isn't an act of defeat, but a recognition, a slow, chilling awareness that the frantic grasp on what was, or what was promised, had become the true burden. We cling to narratives, to outcomes, to the imagined comfort of control, yet these very attachments are the threads that bind us to a silent, relentless suffering. It's in the desperate hope for a different past, a kinder present, a predictable future, that we forge our own invisible chains. The world doesn't shift for our clinging, it simply continues its indifferent, beautiful, brutal spin. And in this futility, a question arises, not of why, but of, for how long? For how long will the breath be caught in the throat, the shoulders hunched against an invisible blow, merely because the mind insists on a reality that isn't unfolding? The cessation of caring is not a sudden, triumphant freedom, but a slow, often painful, untangling. It is the weary acknowledgement that the battlefield was always within, and the war was waged against the self, by the self, for the phantom promise of a peace that could only arrive when the weapons were finally laid down. This isn't about apathy, it's about the deep, resonant exhale after holding one's breath for a lifetime. There's a subtle shift in the air, barely perceptible at first, like the whisper of a leaf falling in an empty room. It's the sound of resistance draining away, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate trickle. This isn't about ignoring the pain or dismissing the past. It's about acknowledging its presence without letting it dictate the present moment. The mind, accustomed to its ceaseless narrating of grievances and unfulfilled desires, finds itself with less to grasp onto. The familiar anchors of resentment and expectation begin to rust and crumble. It's a terrifying freedom, this unmooring, because it exposes the raw, unshielded self to the vast, indifferent ocean of existence. There are no longer the sturdy walls of if only, or when that happens, to hide behind. The raw exposure compels a direct confrontation with what truly is, devoid of the comforting lies we tell ourselves about control and destiny. The initial pangs of loss for the illusions we nurtured are real, sharp, and undeniable. But beneath them, a strange quietude begins to bloom, a spaciousness previously occupied by the clamor of what should be. The architecture of our interior world begins to subtly reconfigure itself. What was once a fortress built of fear and defense now shows cracks, not of weakness, but of release. The relentless internal negotiation with reality, the desperate attempts to bend it to our will, cease their exhausting rhythm. It's as if a grand, intricate machine, designed to process and control every external input, slowly loses its primary function. The energy once consumed by worry, by the pursuit of validation, by the bitterness of unmet expectations, now floats untethered, seeking new channels. This reallocation of internal resources is not an intentional act of will, but a consequence of the letting go. The very foundations of our anxieties, often rooted in the stories we tell ourselves about our own significance and the necessity of external approval, erode from within. There is no longer a need to impress, to prove, to conform to an invisible standard. The raw, unfiltered self begins to emerge, not as a defiant rebellion, but as a simple, unadorned state of being. The world, in turn, reflects this internal shift, not because it has fundamentally changed, but because our perception, stripped of its demanding filters, now allows for a different kind of seeing. The internal dialogue, once a relentless, often accusatory hum, begins to lose its sharp edges. The critic, fueled by unmet desires and perceived failures, finds its voice growing fainter. This isn't a deliberate silencing, but a natural consequence of withdrawing the energy that once fed its insatiable hunger. We stop arguing with the ghosts of what might have been, or the specters of what others think. The endless striving for an imagined perfection, or the desperate need for external validation, suddenly appears as the exhausting, self-defeating loop it truly is. There's a quiet reclaiming of sovereignty, not over the world, but over the self. The mind, no longer burdened by the incessant need to control or define every outcome, finds a new kind of spaciousness. It begins to observe, rather than judge, to witness, rather than react. This detachment isn't coldness, it's a profound recognition that much of our suffering stems from the narratives we impose upon reality, rather than reality itself. The world in its indifferent grandeur simply is, and when we cease to demand it conform to our internal script, a deeper, more resonant peace begins to settle within. The echoes of past hurts, once insistent and sharp, begin to soften, their resonance fading into the background hum of existence. It's not that the memories vanish, but their emotional grip loosens. The mind, no longer tethered by the desperate need to relitigate every perceived slight or injustice, begins to release its hold on the narrative of victimhood. There's a profound understanding that clinging to these wounds only perpetuates the suffering, turning the past into a perpetual present. This process isn't about forgiveness in the traditional sense, but about liberation from the self-imposed prison of resentment. The energy once consumed by bitterness and self-pity is now free, unburdened by the weight of what cannot be changed. It's a quiet, internal alchemy, transforming the lead of grievance into something lighter, more fluid. The focus shifts from what was done to us to how we choose to respond now. This newfound freedom is not a sudden epiphany, but a gentle unfolding, a deepening awareness that true peace resides not in the absence of external conflict, but in the cessation of internal war. The urgency to define oneself through external validation, through titles, possessions, or the approval of others begins to dissipate. It's a quiet shedding of skins, each one representing an identity carefully constructed for the gaze of the world. The mirror no longer holds the weight of judgment nor the promise of affirmation. What emerges is a raw, unadorned self, stripped of its carefully curated defenses and pretensions. This isn't about becoming indifferent to human connection, but about reevaluating the nature of that connection. Relationships shift from transactions, where one person seeks to extract something from another, to an authentic meeting of two distinct beings. The need to manipulate, to impress, to perform all recede, leaving space for a more genuine, albeit sometimes uncomfortable intimacy. The fear of loneliness, too, transforms. It is no longer a gaping void to be frantically filled, but a sacred space for self-communion, for listening to the quiet murmurs of one's own being. This profound liberation from the shackles of external opinion allows for a deeper, more resonant sense of self-acceptance, a knowing that simply being is enough. The pursuit of future happiness, once a relentless chase across an imagined horizon, loses its compulsive grip. The present moment, stripped of its duty to serve as a mere stepping stone to a better tomorrow, begins to reveal its own inherent richness. The "if only" and "when that happens" conditional clauses that once governed our internal landscape start to dissolve, leaving behind the stark immediate reality of now. This isn't a passive resignation, but an active engagement with what unfolds, unburdened by the weight of expectation. The constant projection into a perfected future, a future where all needs are met and all wounds healed, is seen for what it is, a sophisticated form of procrastination from living. The energy once invested in meticulously planning for a hypothetical bliss can now be redirected to the subtle textures, the fleeting beauty, and the quiet challenges of the immediate experience. The cessation of caring about a rigidly defined future paradoxically opens the door to a more vibrant, unpredictable present, where genuine experience can take root, rather than being constantly overshadowed by an anticipated yet perpetually elusive ideal. The anxieties that once gnawed at the edges of consciousness like persistent, hungry mice begin to lose their sustenance. No longer fed by the desperate clinging to outcomes or the relentless rumination on what might go wrong, their grip weakens. This isn't about eradicating fear itself, for fear is an innate part of the human experience, a raw, primal alarm. Instead, it's about transforming the relationship with fear. It becomes an observed sensation, a momentary tremor, rather than an all-consuming dictate. The narrative around fear, the stories we weave about its power to incapacitate and define us, begins to unravel. We cease to be its captive audience, its helpless puppet. This allows for a kind of radical presence, where the raw, unmediated experience of the moment can unfold without the constant static of imagined catastrophes. The world, in its unpredictable grandeur, is no longer perceived primarily as a source of potential threat, but as a dynamic, unfolding reality to be met, moment by moment, with an open, albeit vulnerable heart. The weight of comparison, the endless measuring of self against others begins to lift. The invisible scales, calibrated by societal expectations and personal insecurities, finally cease their relentless tipping. This isn't about becoming superior or indifferent to the achievements of others, but about detaching from the internal competition that breeds envy and inadequacy. The notion that one's worth is contingent upon external validation, upon being better than or more successful than someone else, reveals itself as an exhausting illusion. The energy once consumed by this futile exercise in self-diminishment can now be redirected inward, towards a more genuine exploration of one's own unique path and inherent value. This liberation from the comparative gaze allows for a deeper appreciation of individual journeys, both one's own and that of others. The perceived scarcity of success or happiness, a notion often fueled by relentless comparison, dissolves into a spaciousness where true fulfillment is understood to be an internal state, not a race to be won against an imagined opponent. The persistent yearning for control, the relentless desire to orchestrate life's unfolding, slowly loosens its grip. It's a recognition that the universe operates with an intricate, chaotic dance far beyond the confines of individual will. The illusion of absolute agency, once a comforting yet burdensome belief, gives way to a deeper trust in the unfolding process. This isn't a retreat into passivity, but an active embrace of uncertainty, a willingness to navigate the currents of existence rather than battling against them. The energy once expended on micromanaging outcomes, on meticulously planning every step, is now freed for a more spontaneous and adaptable engagement with reality. The unexpected, once a source of anxiety, transforms into an opportunity for discovery, a chance to witness the unscripted beauty of life. This shift from control to acceptance allows for a deeper surrender to the flow, a profound peace that arises not from having all the answers, but from the quiet knowing that some questions are simply not ours to answer. The clamor for external validation, the relentless seeking of applause or approval, diminishes into a faint echo. The internal scoreboard, once meticulously tallied and judged by the imagined gaze of others, loses its power. This isn't about becoming antisocial or indifferent to human connection, but about disentangling one's inherent worth from the fluctuating opinions of the world. The deep-seated need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be loved by others, transforms into a quiet recognition of one's own intrinsic value. The energy once expended on performing for an audience, on curating a public image, now becomes available for genuine self-discovery and authentic expression. There's a profound liberation in knowing that one's existence doesn't require an external stamp of approval. The fear of criticism, the sting of rejection while still present, no longer possess the power to shatter the core of one's being. This allows for a more honest and direct engagement with the world, unburdened by the constant negotiation of who one should be. The ceaseless pursuit of happiness, often a frantic chase after external conditions, transforms into a quiet appreciation of contentment. It's a subtle shift from the belief that joy is something to be acquired, to the understanding that it is often an emergent quality of being present. The future, no longer laden with the burden of delivering ultimate bliss, can simply unfold. This isn't about abandoning aspirations or dreams, but about detaching from the outcome of those aspirations. The journey itself, with all its inherent challenges and unexpected turns, becomes the focal point rather than the elusive destination. The frantic grasping for more, for better, for different, slowly dissipates, replaced by a deep, resonant understanding of what is already here. There's a profound recognition that much of the suffering stems not from what we lack, but from the relentless insistence that our current reality is insufficient. This allows for a deeper, more sustainable sense of well-being, rooted not in fleeting external circumstances, but in the quiet acceptance of what is. The shadow of regret, once a constant companion, whispering tales of roads not taken and words left unsaid, begins to recede. It's a quiet acknowledgement that every past moment, in its indelible finality, has already played out. The tireless replaying of alternative scenarios, the mental redrafting of conversations, loses its compelling power. This isn't about forgetting the past, but about releasing its emotional tyranny over the present. The profound understanding emerges that clinging to what if only serves to rob the now of its vibrancy. The energy once consumed by self-recrimination and the lament for bygone opportunities can now be channeled into the raw, unadorned experience of what is unfolding. There's a quiet freedom in accepting the inherent imperfection of every choice, every action, every lived moment. This allows for a deeper, more compassionate relationship with oneself, a recognition that the past, in its completed form, is not a burden to be carried, but a foundation upon which a new, unfettered present can be built. The noise of external opinions, once a clamorous symphony demanding attention, begins to recede into a gentle hum. The need to conform, to fit into predefined molds, loses its suffocating pressure. This isn't about becoming defiantly nonconformist, but about discovering an internal compass that points towards authentic self-expression, unburdened by the constant negotiation of external approval. The fear of judgment, the sting of disapproval, while still present, no longer dictates choices or silences the quiet voice of intuition. There's a profound liberation in knowing that one's true value isn't diminished by the shifting tides of popular opinion. The energy once consumed by presenting a carefully curated version of oneself for public consumption is now free to nurture genuine curiosity, explore nascent passions, and cultivate a deeper connection with one's core being. This allows for a more fluid and less rigid interaction with the world, where personal integrity becomes the primary guide, rather than the fleeting validation of others. The horizon of self-definition, once rigid and confined by past experiences and perceived limitations, expands into an unknowable vastness. The quiet surrender to not knowing becomes a source of liberation rather than a cause for anxiety. It's a profound recognition that the essence of being is fluid, ever-changing and uncontainable by labels or fixed narratives. The need to understand every nuance, to categorize every feeling, to explain every facet of existence, slowly dissolves into a deeper trust in the unfolding mystery. This isn't about intellectual apathy, but about embracing the inherent paradoxes and ambiguities of life with a quiet sense of awe. The internal striving for absolute clarity, often a source of relentless frustration, gives way to a more compassionate acceptance of uncertainty. The world, in its bewildering complexity, is no longer a problem to be solved, but a phenomenon to be experienced, moment by moment, with an open heart and a mind unburdened by the relentless demand for definitive answers.